Welcome to this webinar, What Does Peer Reviewed Mean? My name is Fiona Jones and I'm here with my colleague Gemma Noon, and we're going to present this webinar for you today. I'd like to acknowledge the Dark and Young people who are the traditional owners of the land on which I live and work and on which Gemma is today. But I'd also like to extend my acknowledgement to the other lands that people might be coming from today. So I'd like to acknowledge the Awabakal people, the Biripi, the Worimi, the Wonnarua and Eora nations. We pay respect to the wisdom of the elders past, present and emerging. And we'd also like to extend this acknowledgement and our respect to any Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander people that are here today or watching this recording. This is just a little overview of what we're going to cover so that you know what to expect. We titled this webinar, What Does Peer Review Mean? But we're really going to be talking about much more than that. We'd like to give you some context to understand all the different types of scholarly resources that you might need to use for an assignment, how they fit in to each other, and how you can best evaluate which resources will be relevant for you for different needs and for different assignments. So we're going to be looking at how to identify different resource types, what is peer review and how to check whether a resource is peer reviewed. We're going to look at the resource timeline, so how quickly different resource types are published and what that means for your decision about whether to use them or not. What is primary and secondary resources and research, and then of course where to search for and find the most relevant resources for your specific needs. So now I'm going to hand over to Gemma, who's going to be presenting the first part.
Thank you, Fiona. So we're going to start off by talking about what is an academic or scholarly resource. Academic and scholarly are synonyms for each other, so you may see some information that refers to academic sources and some that refers to scholarly sources. It's the same thing. So basically, we are talking about a few different kinds of resources. We're talking about things such as books, journal articles, conference papers, reports by experts, reference works such as subject-specific dictionaries and encyclopedias. And one of the key characteristics about these kinds of sources is that they're reliable. Particularly the journal articles, they are often what we call peer-reviewed sources, and we will talk about the concept of peer-reviewed and how the peer-reviewed process works a little bit later on in this presentation. These kinds of academic or scholarly resources are suitable to use in your assignment at university level. They will often have an academic publisher, such as Oxford University Press, for example. Authors and researchers are experts in their field, and they will have academic qualifications. And these kinds of resources are accessible through the library subscriptions in the library search and in our library databases. So we really recommend that you do try and access these resources via the library website, because that just means that you are actually taking advantage of the subscriptions that the library has paid for, and you won't come across paywalls asking you to pay for articles like you may if you just do a search in Google or in Google Scholar. Next slide, please, Fiona. Thank you. So now we're going to talk about journals and compare them to other kinds of periodicals that you may have heard of. So a periodical publication is published at a regular time point. So they've got a regular publishing schedule. Other kinds of periodicals that are not scholarly, which you may have heard of, include things like trade magazines, leisure magazines, newspapers, newsletters, and yearbooks. Whereas academic or scholarly journals, they have got a different sort of purpose. So they disseminate scholarly research, original ideas and new knowledge, and they go through that peer-reviewed process that I mentioned before. Next slide, please, Fiona. Thank you. Now, going into this topic a little bit further, a definition of an academic or scholarly journal is a periodical publication which publishes scholarship from a specific academic discipline. So, for example, the Journal of Sociology or a Journal of Nursing, a Journal of Engineering. And within an academic journal, we have what's known as journal articles. So journal articles publish a piece of scientific or scholarly research. And you can see there in the example citation from the Journal of Sociology, where it's got an article called Gender Transitions from Education to Work, the mysterious relationship between the fields of education and work. And you can see there in that citation, the title of the journal is in italics, and we've got the volume and issue number as well. So it's really important when you are doing your research and you're finding different resources, make sure you take down all of the information that you need in order to find that source again, so you can reference it properly in your assignment. Because if you can't find it again and you can't actually reference it properly, you don't have all those details, you're not going to be able to use it in your assignment. Next slide, please. Now, we have a question here for you. Which of the following periodicals is peer-reviewed scholarly source? So Fiona has put the link to that poll in the chat. So if you could go through and answer that question, we'll see how you're doing so far. So our possible answers are the Wall Street Journal, Cosmopolitan, Journal for 18th Century Studies, and Accounting Today. How are we going with the poll, Fiona? Has anybody answered yet?
I haven't seen any answers come in yet. I know that it does take a moment to navigate to that website and then put in your name and then answer. So I haven't seen anything come through yet.
Okay, we'll give it a couple more moments then.
If our participants are too shy to do it, you might have to tell them the answer yourself.
No worries. Okay, well, we might move on now. So the answer for this is the Journal for 18th Century Studies. So we had a little bit of a red herring there with the Wall Street Journal. It does have journal in the title, but however, if you were to look up that particular publication, you would find out that that is an American newspaper. Cosmopolitan, of course, is a leisure magazine, a women's magazine. And Accounting Today is a trade publication in the area of accounting. So the Journal for 18th Century Studies is the correct answer there. Next slide, please, Fiona. Now, if we look a little bit further into the anatomy of a resource, just taking apart all of the different details that you need to actually find on a source in order to be able to find it again and reference it correctly in your assignment. In a journal article or a book, or we have things like who. So the who part's talking about the authors, who has actually written this. So generally for a journal article, it's going to be individual people or perhaps a person on their own, but researchers will often work in groups to author journal articles together. Corporate authors you sometimes come across with things like websites or reports. For a book or an ebook, you may have authors who are indicated. Sometimes you will have editors too. So if it's an edited book, a collection of essays that have been put together by an editor, and there may be individual chapters that are written by different people too. So keep in mind that is a consideration that you may have come across when you're looking at a book or an ebook. The when part is talking about when it was published. So how current is that information? The what is talking about the title. So for a journal article, you're talking about not just the title of the article itself, but the title of the journal too. And for the title of a book, you also have the additional information about the edition number of that particular title, depending on if it's an edition that's later than the first edition. You always try and mention that in your citation. And then finally, the where part. This is how you can actually access it again. So for a journal, things like the volume and issue, and if it's an electronic journal, you're going to have a DOI. So that's a digital object identifier. So that's a permanent link, which always will link back to that source, or a URL. And for a book, you will have information about the publisher. So depending on your referencing style, you will have the name of the publisher. You may need to include the place of publication too. And if it happens to be electronic, you will have a DOI or a URL to add to your citation as well. Next slide, please, Fiona. So make sure when you are doing your research, as I said before, take really, really good notes. And as you're evaluating the sources, pay attention to things like the abstract of the article, because that can help you to work out whether or not it's worth reading the entire article or not. Have a look at the keywords that are tagged within the record and the keywords that have been identified by the author, because there may be keywords in there that you could use to find other relevant articles, perhaps some terminology that you haven't thought of already. Same with subject headings and bibliographies as well. If you find a source that you think this is excellent, I want to find other sources like this, always take a look at the bibliography, because that can give you some clues as to some other relevant sources that you mightn't have otherwise found. Next slide, please. Now we have another poll question. Which part of a journal article citation is the DOI or URL? Is it in the where section, the when, the who, or the what? So we'll give you a couple of moments to have a go at that poll, and then we'll have a bit of a talk about the answer.
All right, we've got some responses coming in this time, which is great.
Wonderful.
Gemma, would you like me to share the response screen so
Yeah,
that we
that'd
can
be great.
see?
Thanks, Fiona.
All right, so all our respondents are in agreement that the part of the journal article citation, which is the DOI or URL, is where to find that article.
Yeah,
so they've done
correct.
well.
Wonderful. Okay, so we're going to move on from our poll question. Next slide, please. Now we're going to talk about the concept of peer review in a little bit more detail. A synonym for peer review that you may come across is refereed. So peer review is a term that relates to journal articles, and if a journal article is peer reviewed, it's a high quality journal article that has been through the peer review process. So the peer review process is when the article is checked by a panel of the author's scholarly peers who are experts in that subject before the journal article has been published. So if your assignment states that you need a peer-reviewed journal article, you can tick peer-reviewed in the library search or in most databases, just to ensure that you're getting those kinds of high-quality journal articles coming up in your search results. Next slide, please. A way that you can check if the publications that you are finding are peer-reviewed or not is to look them up in an online directory called Ulrich's Web. And we've got the URL of that there, and Fiona has popped a link in the chat. So that's a really useful resource to just look things up in if you are not sure if a particular journal is peer-reviewed or not. Next slide, please. So now we're going to talk about primary and secondary sources from the perspective of the humanities, arts and social sciences disciplines. So in these kinds of subject areas, things like history, communication, sociology, any kind of arts subject, primary sources are original documents and objects containing first-hand information. So they're generally from the time period that you're talking about. Things like autobiographies, so when writers have written things about their own lives, memoirs, diaries, letters, eyewitness accounts and interview transcripts, speeches, legal documents and court transcripts, historical newspapers, magazines or periodical articles from the time being studied, video footage, sound recordings, original works of art, including literature, images, photographs and drawings, archival records, logs, ledgers or data, and original research. Now, in contrast to that, secondary sources are commentary about a primary source. So a biography, which is when somebody writes about somebody else's life. So it's kind of like a third person look at somebody else's experiences. Literary criticism and reviews, books on a particular topic, indexes, abstracts and bibliographies, which can help you to locate other primary and secondary sources, current newspaper articles from the present day, and journal articles. So we'll just move to the next slide and talk about a little bit of a caveat with all of these kinds of definitions of primary and secondary sources. Sometimes the distinction between primary and secondary sources can be ambiguous, and document type is not always the sole indicator of a primary and secondary source. So we really need to think about not just the categories of these resources and what they are, but also the context in which you're looking at them and the question that you're actually trying to answer when you're looking at them. So if we, for example, are looking up information about the Mabo decision and we find a newspaper article from the time that that decision was reached in the High Court, or if we're looking at court documents from the time, they would be examples of a primary source, whereas a recent newspaper article talking about that, say, for example, from the present day on the anniversary of the Mabo decision, that is not usually a primary source. Another example we have for you is the movie Capote. So that's a secondary source about the author Truman Capote and the writing of his book In Cold Blood. But it would be a primary source for research about the work of the director of that film, Bennett Miller. And a final example is if you're looking at a painting by the artist Frida Kahlo, that would be a primary source, whereas a reference book, a novel or a movie about Kahlo and her work would be a secondary source. Next slide, please. Now, when we are trying to find relevant resources for the HASS discipline, you can definitely look in our library catalogue, library search, but keep in mind that when you do search the library catalogue, that's searching for information from all of the different disciplines that we have at the University of Newcastle. So it's a really, really good idea to have a look at the subject resource guides for your specific discipline. And they are organised by alphabetical order. Fiona's just put a link in the chat to the subject research guides, and they will list all of the different databases and different resources such as dictionaries and encyclopedias, links to various websites such as professional associations, which are really, really good for your specific discipline. So if you're not quite sure yet which databases are good to use for your subject, have a look at those. And it's always a good idea to look at some subject-specific databases in addition to searching in the library catalogue, just to make sure that you don't accidentally miss out on any important information. When you are first looking at your assignment question too and analysing it, it's a really good idea to have a look at a subject-specific dictionary or encyclopedia, because that can help you to think of different synonyms and related terms that you might also want to use when you are constructing your search and thinking about what keywords you might want to search in order to find information to answer your question. Next slide, please. Okay, now I'm going to hand over to Fiona, who is going to talk about the resource timeline in a bit more detail. Thanks, Fiona.
Thanks, Gemma. So we're going to begin with an activity. We're going to think about 4 different types of resources: books, journal articles, conferences, and encyclopedias, and think about which ones are published quickly and which ones take a long time to be published. Now, you may be thinking, why do I care about this? But I'm hoping after we've talked about this for a little while, it will be helpful to you to understand a bit of background, a bit of context around how scholarly information is published and what that means for you in terms of using different types of resources for your assignments. So again, we've got another poll activity. So it's at the same link. This time it's a drag and drop activity. So if you're doing this one on your phone, it may be a little bit more fiddly than the last one. You'll have to tap on a resource and then you can drag it to the spot that you want it to be. So we want the things that are published the most quickly at the top of the list and the things that take a longer time at the bottom. And I'm just going to navigate to my other screen so I can see how that's going, if anyone has answered that one yet. All right, so we've had some answers. I'm just going to go ahead and share the screen so you can all see. So what we've got is conferences being the quickest, then journal articles, then books, then encyclopedias, and that is exactly right. So our participants today are all over this, but I'm going to expand a little bit on the process and just help you to understand what that means for you if you're choosing different resources for your assignment. And let me just switch over. All right, so you can see that my timeline agrees with you guys, which is great. So we're going to think a little bit about how scholarly information gets out there. So there's a researcher. They have created some new knowledge. They have discovered a new relationship or a new pattern. They've developed a new theory. They've devised a new treatment. And they want to get this knowledge out there. They want to share it. That's really important because sharing that knowledge allows 3 things to happen. So firstly, it means that other researchers can test it. So they can do a study on a similar topic and see if what the first researcher has found is correct or not. The second thing is that this new idea can then be translated in such a way that it can make an impact in the world. So for instance, it could be a new practice that happens in maybe education or in nursing or so forth based on this new knowledge, or there could be a new invention. So it's really important they share what they've found out. And the third thing is that each time a researcher shares their new knowledge, it builds up a body of evidence and knowledge in that particular discipline. So it's added to that. And that means researchers that come after them can build on that. So it's really, really important that researchers get their information out there. And there's a lot of different ways that they can do that. So what they might do early on, if an idea is in development, they've just done a small pilot study, or they may even have a study that's in progress and they've got some initial results, is they might present at a conference. They might present something like a poster, they might do a short oral presentation, they might just share an abstract, or they might write a full paper. So these are published relatively quickly. Conferences often happen annually for different disciplines, and they'll put out a call for presentations a few months before the conference. The person who wants to present needs to put in a submission, and then a few months later, they'll be presenting. So it's a really great way for researchers to share new ideas, new knowledge that is maybe not even tried and tested yet. So what does this mean for you if you find something from a conference and you think you might want to use it in your assignment? So there's a couple of questions you should be thinking about, and we're not going to talk about the evaluation process in detail today, but a couple of questions that you're always going to be asking when you're evaluating a resource is, firstly, how much can I rely on the results of this? So one thing to be aware of is that often posters, oral presentations and abstracts haven't been through a formal peer review process, whereas full papers that have been published in the conference proceedings usually have gone through that peer review process. So that is something to bear in mind. And the other thing that you often ask yourself when you're evaluating resources is the timeliness of the information. So as I said, conference papers come out quickly. They're a great way for people to get out new knowledge. So if you find something relevant from a very recent conference, then that's great. That might be a cutting edge new idea that will be very useful for you. However, on the other hand, if what you've found is from a conference that was several years ago, it would definitely bear in mind to look for more recently published things to see if that new idea has been confirmed or whether maybe it's been refuted by someone else. And so just bearing that in mind, that some disciplines are very fast moving and conference papers are where it's at for all the new research, whereas some disciplines tend to take longer to develop new ideas and new knowledge. So they don't usually publish things in conferences as much. So then moving on, after a conference paper or presentation, the researcher may be looking to publish a journal article. And so this process takes a little bit longer because what I'm going to focus on is those peer-reviewed scholarly journals that Gemma was talking about before. So it takes a bit longer because the researcher submits their paper, and then the editor of the journal sends that out to 3 or sometimes even more reviewers that are also experts in that same field. They read and they check the paper, and they will make suggestions for changes that need to be made. And then the author will need to make those changes, send it back, and this may go back and forth a few times before it is published. The article will only be accepted and published if the methodology and the results have been checked and have passed muster. There are no errors in their methodology or the conclusions they've made based on their results. And so it, obviously takes longer for that to happen, but it means that you can rely on the information there because of the fact that it's been peer reviewed. And so there's a bit of a payoff in waiting a bit longer for that. I will mention that if you do a search and you come across what is called a preprint, read the fine print. So often preprints are the version of an article that a researcher has written before it's been accepted for publication, so before it's been through that peer review process. So again, in some really fast-moving disciplines, it's really important for researchers to read other researchers' preprints and be right on top of the new knowledge as it's coming out. But for you as a student, you would definitely be looking for things that have been published and have been through that peer review process if possible. And if you find something that's a preprint, but you notice it's actually been uploaded to that preprint server some time ago, have a look if perhaps that article has now been through the publishing process and has been published in a journal somewhere, and you can read the version that has been through that process. Another type of journal article is a review article. So this one is a little bit different in that it is not someone presenting the results of their own research project. It is someone who has collected together a number of journal articles that have all been written on the same topic, all addressing the same research question, and they have synthesized the results together. So it makes sense then that it takes longer for those sort of articles to be published from the time of first ideas emerging, because you need a number of people to have done studies or to have written on that topic so that then you can do a really good, robust search. You can pull together, appraise the quality of all those papers, and then synthesize together to come up with a decision on whether, say, perhaps that particular intervention is effective or whatever else it is that you're looking at in that review. So these ones, take a little bit longer, but again, you can rely on the evidence presented because of the fact that they've synthesized together the results of many different researchers. So now we're moving on to books. I've got a couple of different examples there. The first one is a scholarly monograph. So this one is usually written by one author, and it's like an extra long journal article. So it's a way for a researcher to present the results of their research in a longer format. And it's often more likely to be across humanities or social sciences disciplines. So disciplines that do that text-based discussion. And so that one will take longer to publish again, even than a journal article, because it has to go through similar editing processes, although a little bit different than for a journal article, but they've also got to do all the hard copy printing and that sort of thing, so it does take longer. In terms of quality control, an editor will work with an author. They'll choose an expert in the field, and you can also read book reviews to assess the quality of a scholarly monograph. A different type of book is an edited book. So this one is compiled by an editor or editors who are experts in a particular field, and they have called upon other experts to join with them to write various chapters on a particular topic. And those chapters, they won't usually be showcasing some brand new research or something cutting edge or, new and controversial. They will usually be pulling together current but accepted knowledge on a particular topic in the field. And so books are really helpful if you need a bit of a broader perspective. Journal articles usually focus on one very specific research question, and they often are talking about the results just of one specific study, whereas in a book, like an edited book, they can look across a topic or field of research and pull together different perspectives or different context for you. And lastly, once knowledge is tried and tested, we definitely know that that's the accepted knowledge in a field, it will make its way into reference works like dictionaries, encyclopedias, and handbooks. So what does that mean for you? That means if you need some background information, you need to know what a particular term actually means. You need to do a bit of background reading on a theory that you're supposed to be discussing in your assignment or so forth. Then these are authoritative sources for you. Instead of just Googling what does such and such mean, if you go to a subject-specific dictionary or encyclopedia, you can find authoritative information. It's often not usual to cite them a whole lot in your assignment, although you can, but there definitely should be the source for you to feel that you understand the concepts that you're talking about. Now I'm going to look at primary and secondary research from a STEM perspective, so a little bit different to what Gemma spoke about before. The primary research is when the author is actually conducting some sort of research project. So they are collecting and analysing data, they're describing the results that they found, and they're discussing the findings and maybe discussing the implications of what they've discovered. That research project could be quantitative, so they could be collecting data about things you can count. They could be measuring things, or it could be qualitative, so they could be interviewing people or making observations, or it could be a mixture of those, a mixed methods project. And so for you as a student, if you were, say, writing up a lab report, so you'd done an experiment in one of your classes and you had to write up a report describing the results, that, so what your method was, what your results were, and writing some sort of conclusion, then what you're producing in the STEM fields is primary research. Secondary research, however, is when the author reviews, synthesises, or evaluates primary research written by other people. So examples are review articles, but also often edited books will include chapters that have pulled together the research of several different researchers. So for you as a student, if you're writing an essay or an annotated bibliography or another assignment which is focusing on a topic, and you're pulling together information from different people, but you're not actually running your own study, you're not collecting your own data, then what you're producing is what we call secondary research. Gemma showed you one of the subject resource guides for one of the humanities disciplines earlier. And I just want to remind you that we have these for all disciplines, including all the STEM disciplines. On this slide, there's an image from our allied health guide, and I want to point out a couple of things on here. Of course, we'll have links to databases. Databases are where you'll find a lot of the journal articles, perhaps conference proceedings, all that scholarly literature that we've been talking about. But we also have links to other types of information that you may need. So you can see on this image that we have different tabs that you can click into. So for instance, if you need to look for resources that are specifically about Indigenous health, you can click there. Specifically about conditions and diseases, you can click there. Anatomy and physiology, or policies and guidelines. So different types of resources. And it's really important to be evaluating what your need is whenever you're looking for information, and whether what you're finding is meeting your need, if it's actually appropriate for what you're looking for. And you can see that there's also a page for discipline-specific resources, which will drill down a little bit more into some of those sub-disciplines in allied health specifically. We have other guides across the STEM field that have links to other types of information too. So for example, our engineering guide will include links to literature databases, but will also include links to places that you can find standards or find patents, because they are very relevant for that discipline. And many of our subject resource guides have links to reference works. So on the screen here, you can see that there's a couple of ebooks linked there, and one of them is a medical dictionary. And so remember that this is the place to get authoritative background information if you need it. So we've now reached the end of our webinar. And the last slide just has links to ways to get help from the library. The first link is to our general Ask the Library page. And on that page, you can find all the different ways you can get in contact with us. So you can come up to a service zone in one of our libraries. You can call us on the phone. You can use the chat for quick questions, or you can send us an email with a longer question and we'll get back to you. But underneath that is a link to our Book a Librarian service, which is what we recommend if you've got a specific query about your assignment that you think you're going to need a little bit longer to discuss. You can book in at a time that suits you for a 25-minute one-on-one meeting with a librarian, which can be in person at one of our campus libraries or online via Zoom. That way, if you're looking for resources for your assignment, or you need some help evaluating which ones to use, help referencing, understanding the different types of resources and which ones are best, you can book in and a librarian will talk you through it. Thanks so much for being here with us this morning. Gemma, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
No, I think that was a very comprehensive presentation. So yes, thank you so much, everyone, for attending today. And yes, as Fiona said, if you need some assistance, please don't hesitate to contact us, because that's what we're here for.